name is Paul Trevisan, and I'm a volunteer docent here at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. And I'm going to speak in a moment regarding the airlift that was over the Himalaya Mountains called the Hump. But before I do, I wanted to show off a piece of memorabilia that's very symbolic of the China-Burma-India theater. It's called a blood chit, and it was worn by pilots who flew in both the AVG and later on in the 23rd Fighter Group. And it was also on the jackets of pilots who flew the Hump. And we have with us one of our other volunteer docents, a gentleman by the name of Lu Zhang, who's going to come up because the blood chit was written in Chinese so that Chinese could actually read it and help American downed pilots. And Lu's going to help us actually describe the blood chit, its significance, and how to translate it. So let me introduce Lu. We actually have an authentic World War II flight jacket here with a blood chit on it. So it's a very important piece of memorabilia, and I'm going to let Lu talk about the blood chit, which was, again, worn by pilots in the China-Burma-India theater.
It's my pleasure to help to translate this blood chit. Here you can see this have a U.S. flag and then Republic of China flag. Republic of China flag with the red background with the blue canton with the white sun and the 12 triangle rays on it. And then here written only in Chinese, and then particularly because this memorial is very unique. It's actually braced the Chinese character right here are not the same as most other plastic you will see for the flying tiger. Here I translate see this person come to China to help the war to fight Japanese. And actually this special one that here is same Chinese character, but written a little different way. And also this the foreign person, it here says from American, and then come to China. Here it says the civilian and the military person should all work together to help to rescue or protect this person. And also this is the Chinese Aviation Committee that issues the number, what I can read here very hard is the 451. So this is the blessed translation. Good.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Paul Trevisan again, and what I'd like to talk about is the 1942 to 1945 military airlift over the Himalayas, commonly referred to as the Hump. It was the biggest airlift conducted by the Allies in World War II, and kind of captured, and it was a kind of combination effort between the Chinese Air Force, Chinese National Aviation Corporation, and the United States Army Air Force. Have here a nice picture of the Chinese pilot wings that they flew with, and this is a demonstration or a symbol of the wings that our United States Army Air Force pilots flew with. Next slide. So the other half of the mural that Ron spoke about, which focused on the American volunteer group, if you go around the corner, you actually see a nice pictorial demonstration of a C-47 flying over the Hump. And we have some really nice memorabilia that's included that gives a tribute to the combination of both the United States Army Air Force and the Chinese National Aviation Corporation in their efforts to develop that supply line over the Himalaya Mountains. I'm going to refer to it as the China-Burma-India Theater. Of course, Burma is now known as Myanmar. And the Chinese Burma-India Theater was really kind of known as the forgotten theater. You know, the American press spent a lot of time talking about the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific, but there was a significant amount of action being conducted in that China-Burma-India Theater, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So some of the background information: Japan invaded China in 1937. General Chiang Kai-shek had to retreat to Chongqing. And the Chinese army at that time was being supplied through Burma from Rangoon Harbor and then up by rail through the Burma Road. But in April of 1942, Japan captured the Burma Road, and a new way of supplying both the British and the American Air Force and the Chinese in China had to be developed. Roosevelt at that time saw the importance of that, and so he promised China through Chiang Kai-shek that he would develop some kind of way to continue to supply the Japanese army. It was in our best interest to do that because the Japanese had to conduct operations in China and hold China and maintain a presence in China, and it held up to 1 million men from having to fight in the Pacific theater. So there was a real interest in keeping Chinese pinned down in China. So the 10th Air Force was created once we entered the war, based out of India, and they were beginning to conduct their operations in China and in India. But their focus was primarily fighters and bombers against the Japanese Air Force. And they weren't really that interested in conducting an air supply route with transport planes. So in 1942, the responsibility for that fell on the Air Transport Command, which assumed control of the Hump operations. And so it was at that point in time that the USA, Britain, and China tried to figure out a way to develop this way of getting supplies into China from India. Next slide. So this map is a really good pictorial of really the amount of territory in China that Japan actually conducted operations in. They went all the way into Beijing, which is what Peking at the time, Beijing now. They captured Hong Kong. They captured Haiphong Harbor. But the most important part was that at the time, Rangoon was a harbor that was being used to supply the Chinese army in Kunming. And when they captured Burma all the way up into the northern part of Burma, that road was captured, and a new way of trying to get supplies to Kunming had to be figured out because they couldn't use the Burma Road anymore. Next slide. So the protagonists, or the main leaders of the operation, as you can see here, we have General Chiang Kai-shek, we have FDR, we have Churchill, and we have Madam Chiang. It's interesting, everybody kind of had their own agenda when it came to the China-Burma-India theater. Chiang Kai-shek wanted his army supply, or he was going to lose China to Japan. He was both the military and the political leader in China at the time. FDR wanted to supply the Chinese army because he felt that would keep Japanese troops tied down from having to fight in the Pacific. Churchill was interested in seeing China maintain its position and not fall to Japan because China's right on the border of India. And if China fell, the next country that might fall would be India, and that was considered the crown jewel of the British Empire. So he had an interest in making sure that China did not fall. And Madam Chiang, through all this, became actually pretty famous. You know, she made numerous trips to the United States supporting the efforts of her husband to fight the Japanese. Next slide. So the early hump routes that were established actually were pioneered by the Chinese National Aviation Corporation. And at the time, it was kind of a partnership between Pan Am and the Chinese government. And during the war, the Chinese National Aviation Corporation kind of did their hump operations separate from the American Air Force, but they both continued to do operations over the hump to supply both the Chinese Army, Chennault's Air Force, and the British Army. The major route was primarily from Assam in India to Kunming, China. This was about 500 miles air route over the Himalaya Mountains. And the first pilot to kind of pioneer that route was Xiao Pu, who was a Chinese national aviation pilot. So by March of 1942, 100 airline pilots who were reserve commissioned, flew the first group of C-47s over to India. And so we got this thing going roughly by the middle of 1942. Now, at about the same time, as Ron had indicated in his talk, the AVG was disbanded, and about 17 pilots chose to remain in China to fly the hump. So they actually kind of provided some early support for experienced pilots to fly the hump. Next slide. So this is a nice map of, so this is Rangoon. So before the Burma Road was captured, there was a railway that would take supplies to Miyakina. From there, it connected to the Burma Road, and the Burma Road would then connect those supplies to Kunming. But when the Japanese took over this portion of the Burma Road, they had to figure out a different way to supply Chiang Kai-shek, Chennault, and the British. And so they started from Dinjan, which, as you can see, is now part of India. This is the major route over the hump to Kunming. And this is over the southern part of the Himalaya Mountains. So this kind of gives you a perspective of where the hump was actually located. Next slide. So this is a nice pictorial of a plaque that we have that pays tribute to the Chinese National Aviation Corporation. It talks a little bit about the history. It's right here in the museum. It's on the AVG Hump mural. So you're welcome to come by and see that when you're in the museum. It has a nice symbol here of the China, Burma, India patch for the United States Army Air Force. And it has a nice symbol here of the Chinese National Aviation Corporation. Next slide. So what were some of the early challenges? By the end of 1942, there were really only a small number of C-47s supplied to the Hump, and only half of them were in service at any point in time. They found the communications were very unreliable. Radios in the Himalaya mountain range had very limited range. They weren't very good for navigation, so this really made flying the Hump very dangerous in the very beginning. The only all-weather field that was available to both the Army Air Force and the Chinese in India was Dinjan. So they didn't have a lot of all-weather airfields either. You have to remember India at the time didn't have a big infrastructure either. So there was a huge challenge in just trying to figure out where the route was going to start and terminate in Kunming. So the other kind of political issue that was going on was General Joe Stilwell, who ran the American ground forces in China, and General Clayton Bissell, who was the general in charge of the 10th Air Force. They didn't really believe that an airlift operation would effectively work. And they kind of continued to push for reopening the Burma Road with military action. But General Hap Arnold and Chennault favored the air route, as did FDR. And that's why they continued to push building up the resources in India to supply that route over the Himalayas. Next slide. So again, we have the generals here listed. We have General Dill, who was British, Chennault, Arnold, Stilwell, and Bissell. So, and again, they all had different political ideas and operational ideas of how this Hump thing would work. And so it's interesting, the dynamics that you read about what was going on behind the scenes. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the conditions. When you talk about weather, flying the Himalayas was some of the worst weather in the world, right? Masses moving from the west, which are basically high pressure, hit Siberian lows coming in from Russia. They all kind of converged in the Himalaya mountains, which caused really violent weather. Not to mention, any pilot who's flown in mountains will tell you that there's updrafts and downdrafts. The weather can change in a minute. And this was true, only magnified in terms of the challenge of the Himalayas, which are the highest mountain ranges in the world. Next slide. So from a pilot's perspective, I think this is an interesting quote. There were pilots who made instrument flights from Assam to Kunming, back to Assam, and then back to Kunming all in one day. Over 1,500 miles at 18,000 feet or better, mostly over enemy territory, and without seeing the ground except at points of departure and destination. They basically flew in the clouds the whole way there and back. You can't keep up flights like this without learning things. It develops some men, it breaks others. Those pilots suffer from a fatigue that is as bad as combat fatigue, if not worse. So those pilots of the Ferry Command did it not only for the 3 months that I was there, they kept on, and they're flying the Hump today. So this was written by Colonel Robert Scott, who's also been described as the guy who ran the 23rd Fighter Group and is the author of God is My Co-Pilot. So he described what it was like to fly the Hump pretty accurately. So to kind of continue on some of those conditions, that part of the world has huge monsoon season from May to October. For almost 6 months of the year, you were dealing with horrific weather. There were maintenance issues because the supply chain for spare parts was iffy. The heat and humidity was damaging to rubber and leather and other parts. Parts rusted. The heat was so bad during the day in some instances that you couldn't even touch metal. So most of the maintenance on airplanes had to be done at night. It was so bad at one point in time, General Hap Arnold sent Colonel Eddie Rickenbacker, famous for World War I fighter ace for the Americans, to India to kind of assess the operations. And he came up with the same assessment that was described by Ron when he talked about the conditions that the AVG flew under. Poor morale of pilots, reliability of aircraft, the overall challenge of not just getting supplies over the hump 500 miles by air, but getting the supplies themselves to Assam, India, right, which is a 12,000-mile supply chain. So you still had to get supplies to India to get over the hump to China. A huge, huge challenge back then. So I'm just going to go through real quick the planes that are famous for flying the hump. The venerable C-47 was one of the first planes to kind of end up over there that started flying cargo. Next slide. The C-87 was a converted Liberator bomber, a Liberator B-24 bomber. Great bomber, not a great cargo plane, but they did press these four-engined airplanes into service to fly both material and fuel into the China-Burma-India theater. Next slide. In 1944, later on, the C-54 Skymaster was introduced. It was a high-altitude four-engine airplane. It really helped to increase the tonnage over the hump. Next slide. But ultimately, the workhorse aircraft of the hump was the C-46 Commando. It was also introduced in 1944. It was kind of rushed into service, but it was twice, it could fly higher than the C-47. It could fly faster. It carried twice the cargo, so it became kind of the workhorse twin engine. It was the biggest twin engine transport plane at that time. And once they worked out the reliability issues and other issues, it became a pretty good airplane. Next slide. So some interesting accomplishments by the men who flew the hump and supported the hump in that forgotten theater. So by 1945, 650,000 tons of material were flown over the hump. And you can see 38,000 of those trips and a little over 100,000 tons flown by the CNAC. They lost 600 aircraft. It was a dangerous mission. Over 1,600 personnel were killed or missing, but the airlift provided critical supplies to the Chinese and British Army, who were really the ones on the ground. They were the troops that were mostly involved in the fight in China. Chennault's Air Force was supplied by the Air Transport Command, and the Matterhorn operation in 1944, which we could do a whole talk on it but by itself, but there was an effort to base B-29s in the northern part of China because that was closer to Japan than any of the islands that the Allies had captured at the time. So the thought was LeMay would move a couple of squadrons of B-29s into China and fly them to Japan. But the logistical challenge of supplying a very new and radically designed aircraft, their fuel requirements and parts requirements were such that it diverted a lot of effort from the ATC to try to supply that project. In the end, it became a logistics nightmare and they withdrew those B-29s, but there was a valiant effort to see if they could base 29s in China to bomb Japan, but it didn't really play out in the long run. So the China, Burma, India ATC was awarded a presidential citation. One of the accomplishments in January of 1944 by President Roosevelt is the first of this award given to a non-combat organization. This is what that looks like. You'll actually see that medal on the breast of uniforms that the pilots who flew the hump wore. Another interesting thing that came out of the hump was that the 10 former AVG pilots, and it might actually have been more than that, formed the Flying Tiger line. So it was really the first dedicated air cargo line developed, and the Flying Tiger airline kind of remained in service, pioneered routes all over the world in air cargo, kind of long before FedEx and long before DHL came along. They were ultimately sold to FedEx in 1988. So that was one of the results of some of the lessons learned in the hump. And also lessons learned applied to the Berlin airlift in 1948. So at the end of the day, just to kind of give you a sense, in August of 1943, they were flying about 4,000 tons that month over the hump. 11 months later, in September of 1944, that went to 24,000 tons. So the hump really kicked in by 1944 and was actually kind of meeting the tonnage requirements finally in the last couple of years of the war. I'll mention one other thing. So it became very clear to the Air Force after this effort of the hump and then later on the Berlin airlift that strategic airlift capability was a strategic advantage in war. To be able to move material and men anywhere, anytime became a huge advantage. So even though the Air Force gets a lot of credit They call, the fighters and the bombers are the shakers, but the transports are actually the movers, and the Air Force has invested heavily in air transport aircraft, including the C-5, the C-17, and the C-130. And so they've learned the lesson that strategic airlift power is really, really important. So now we have an Air Force that can move anything, anywhere, anytime. Next slide. Finally, I'd like to kind of point out some notable men who served in the China-Burma-India Theater. You might recognize Major General Barry Goldwater. He later became U.S. Senator and a presidential candidate. Lieutenant Colonel Robert S. McNamara later became Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration and head of the World Bank. Colonel Robert Scott, who we've talked a lot about, author of God is My Co-Pilot and leader of the 23rd Fighter Group. And personal call out to Captain Gildo G. Trevisan, who flew 65 missions over the Hump, received an Air Medal and became an active member of the Hump Pilot Association. This is a patch from the Air Transport Command that those pilots wore on one shoulder. And this is, of course, the China-Burma-India patch that they also wore. The reason I'm bringing up Trevisan is because he's my dad, and he flew the Hump. This is a picture of him just getting started. I think he's a lieutenant in 1942. Fast forward, retired. I think he's about age 70 in his picture in the cockpit of a C-46 wearing this flight jacket, which is the jacket he wore in his missions over the Hump, roughly 1995. So kind of glad he survived the Hump, because if he didn't, then myself, my brother, and my sister wouldn't be here. So kind of glad he made it through. Thank you.